Now hear a 4-minute rebuttal by Bruce Fisher, following which we'll have another 4-minute rebuttal by Bruce Daniel.
And thank you very much, Bruce. The 2 verses on, also in the DNC 49, it says, "And woe be unto the man that sheddeth blood, or that wasteth flesh, and hath no need." So in order to argue that BYU students should be eating meat, and that Mormonism justifies eating meat, you have to make the case on the basis of the quote that Bruce just read, that there is a need to eat meat. I hope that nobody here thinks that there is a need to eat meat, but Bruce certainly ceded that there is not a need to eat meat, that vegetarianism is a virtue, and his case basically rests on everything that is a virtue is not an ethical necessity. I would certainly agree, everything that is a virtue is not an ethical necessity, but I would like to suggest, and I hope that I can convince you, that although many of us don't live up to what our ethical aspirations might be, vegetarianism nevertheless is an ethical necessity for people who are trying to lead a compassionate and a morally just life. On the first point, the environmental point, I agree that there are many things that we do that are not environmental, and I agree that in every instance we can't be perfectly environmental. I would, however, suggest that consuming something that requires 20 times the resources of something else is well beyond the bright line that Bruce raises. If you look at the UN report, Livestock's Long Shadow, which looks at the meat industry in great detail in over 400 pages, Livestock's Long Shadow says eating animals is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale from local to global. It contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. In the end, the meat industry, according to the United Nations, is one of the top 3 causes of every environmental problem, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global. The meat industry is also the #1 cause of global warming. Al Gore's Global Warming Survival Handbook suggests that the #1 thing any individual can do to decrease their greenhouse gas footprint is to stop eating meat. If we care about the environment, there is an ethical obligation to adopt a vegetarian diet. Bruce then makes an argument on the global poverty issue, which is not backed by any mainstream agricultural economist on the planet. The reality is, the reason that the UN Special Envoy on Food called biofuels a human rights crime is that there absolutely is a global competition for grain that causes, there are certainly political issues and economic issues. It is the case that the poor are priced out of the marketplace and that there are issues beyond simply lowering the price. It is also the case that the price of food is 3 times greater than it would be, according to World Bank agricultural economists, if people were not eating meat. And if people were not eating meat, the price would go down, more people would be able to eat. You are literally causing people to starve in the developing world if you're continuing to eat meat. That is a moral issue. On the issue of compassion for animals, this is what you're supporting. So Bruce says that ethical people can choose mercy by choosing more humane meat. I would say you are choosing less misery by choosing more humane meat. Even the so-called most ethical systems, the New York Times on Sunday had a very interesting piece about where happy meat is slaughtered. The animals are shipped oftentimes 10, 20, 30 hours to slaughterhouses that are the identical slaughterhouses. So while I would say that eating these happy cows, and there are no happy chickens. When you drive around, you never see chickens on the side of the road. You do sometimes see cows, and some cows do actually spend more than half their lives doing what cows would do naturally. They are still generally shipped to feedlots, and they are still always shipped vast distances to hideously abusive slaughterhouses that are underregulated. So when you're choosing between misery and mercy, Tolstoy said the taproot of humanitarianism is vegetarianism. He said if we want to be people of peace, people of nonviolence, at the very least we should not be dining on the corpses of tortured animals. And he said that before the advent of factory farming. Yes, there are gradations of abuse. Yes, working for change is important. But when you're choosing between misery and mercy, causing animals to suffer needlessly is mercy, even if it's not as much misery as factory farming systems. Thank you.
We should now hear a 4-minute rebuttal by Bruce Daniel, following which we will enter the cross-examination portion.
Mr. Friedrich, I appreciate your further use of our religious text, the Doctrine and Covenants. I think what the verse that you quoted was well used. One thing that's important to understand when you read Scripture is the context in which it was given. Okay, this revelation was given in the 1800s, and the people who received this revelation kept eating meat. Joseph Smith was not a vegetarian. Clearly, if what this revelation meant to the people who it was given to meant you should never eat meat, that would be a tenet of the Mormon faith. In this modern day, we may say that it's not needed, but that falls under my Brightline critique that says that how are you supposed to determine the difference between a want and a need? We may say that we don't need to eat meat. That may be a judgment that I can make for myself or that Bruce can make for himself. I don't know, though, where we get the authority to say that none of us ever need to eat meat and where we can make that judgment for everyone. And when you apply that back to the context of the Doctrine and Covenants, clearly the interpretation that Bruce Friedrich is using for the Scripture is not the interpretation that it was given under. Because if his interpretation were proper, then Joseph Smith and the other early leaders of the church would have been vegetarian. That's the only, apparently to me, reasonable way to interpret that, is clearly it didn't mean that to them. So, I'll move on from there. Okay, so Bruce makes some pretty good argumentation here about the inefficiency of eating meat. He talks about how, the meat industry is bad. It's considered to be an industry that wastes a lot of resources, which I'm sure we can grant. I will defer to Bruce's expertise on this topic if that is the case. However, one thing I noted is a lot of the quotes he was using were related to biofuels. Biofuels, of course, use vast amounts of organic products and certainly raise the prices. Though I'm not here to talk about biofuels. The second issue that I want to get at is, just because the meat industry is bad, doesn't mean it should be eradicated. Let's look at the banking industry. I think we can agree the banking industry is bad. It kind of screwed us over. We're still dealing with the repercussions of this. My stock options in my company not doing as well as they were at one point. My point here is our response isn't, okay, the banking industry has problems, let's get rid of the banking industry. I'm glad we didn't do that. I have a loan on a home. I'm glad that I could go to a bank and get the loan. I don't believe that we should eradicate an industry simply because it has elements of it that are bad. If the meat industry has elements of it that are bad, I think the best thing is for passionate, knowledgeable, compassionate people like Bruce Friedrich and our friends at PETA to work at changing these industries, not eradicating them. When you go to someone and you say, we want your industry to not exist anymore, that is not a road to improve it. That's a road for people to say, I'm not going to listen to you because you're saying that my livelihood is amoral and my livelihood shouldn't exist. That's not a way to get change. That's a way for people not to listen to you. However, if we as BYU students and PETA members and as concerned people and as Mormons and Catholics, if we go to the meat industries and say, we demand that you change. We demand that you be more humane to your animals. We demand that you not do any one of these number of abuses that Bruce has so eloquently brought out. That's a way for change. If you want people to listen, if we as BYU students want to advocate policies that will make the world a better place, let's advocate policies that have a chance of working as opposed to policies like, let's get rid of the meat industry. I just don't see that as a tenable option. And so if we want our ethical nature, if we want the compassion that we have for the animals in those corporate farms to be seen, our policy shouldn't be no one eat meat. Our policy ought to be, let's do something about these horrible businesses and the way they're treating those animals. He makes an argument about how, if we try to change the industry, we're only choosing less misery and not more mercy. I don't want to get too deep into the semantics of this. I mean, does less misery equal more mercy? I'm not sure I have the time to get into a philosophical discourse on this, but I think the point is that if we put our efforts to change things for the better, if we try to make life better for animals, I think we are going to improve mercy. And as any society can, we can evolve and become more merciful over time.